Welcome to adolescence. Isn't that exciting? Some of you are going, no, no, please, no. I personally don't want to go back. Some are going, yeah, yeah, best time of my life, loved it. Some may still actually be within this time period, which the book would talk about between 11 to 18. Siegel neurologically talks about this time period as being between 12 and 25. So we will talk about that a little bit. So think about these kids. When I do say the word adolescence, what comes to mind for you? What terms come up? It can be fun, exciting, carefree, best time of my life. It can be, I get a lot of like emotional, moody, dramatic, chaotic, puberty, hormones. We kind of get some of all and both and either. And it is a time of chaos in a way. And we'll talk about that. There's a lot going on physiologically and neurologically in this time that account for a lot of that craziness, or what we have, and I apologize for saying that, what sort of society has deemed as craziness. But it's really a quite exciting time. Anyway, we're going to talk about it. But think about what these kids are doing. They are truly walking that bridge between childhood and adulthood. The big question of adolescence is, who am I? In middle childhood, it's where do I fit? And now it's who am I apart from all of these labels or places that I've been in terms of where I fit, besides my family or my friends or my group or my clique or whatever. Who am I as an individual, looking at what I want in my life and what I want to do and how I want to move forward? So there's a real pull that they have towards independence. And then there can sometimes be, though, this real pull away from the responsibility of adulthood and independence, that actually can last a while. So there are these clashing things going on. So let's get into it. First, we'll look at the biosocial, and of course, what starts adolescence, and we can say, well, puberty. Interesting thing about puberty, which many of you probably know, is it starts long before we think it does. So we typically think about puberty as starting when that first period comes, or that first ejaculation arrives. And no, it starts with a change in hormones that can start as early as 8 in our middle childhood kids. So as early as 8, as late as 14, for those hormonal rushes. The menarche and spermarch are actually later in the game. But if we define puberty, it's that time between the first onrush of hormones and full adult physical development. So if you define that, though, through full neurological development, you are looking at 25 or so. We used to think it was 18, that once the brain reached like 18, wherever it was, that was it. But now we know it continues to develop throughout the lifespan, but all the pieces and parts aren't really fully developed and online, and done sort of remodeling themselves until 25. So take what you want from that. Average menarche for girls, 12 years, 8 months. Average spermarch for boys, just under 13. So still, boys tend to be a little later in this game than girls. Girls tend to, especially, we'll see them shoot up in height. We talk about that a lot in terms of what girls, how they mature a little bit faster, and it does tend to happen for them a little before the boys. Okay, so it begins with a hormone increase, body chemicals. So we know that, these hormones regulate a lot of things. They regulate hunger, sleep, mood, stress, sexual desire, immunity, reproduction. Many of those of which we see kind of change during this time period, right? Hunger, the amount that we eat and sleep, and oh my goodness, and teenagers, we can't get them out of bed in the morning and we can't get them to go to bed at night. Well, actually, some of that makes sense with what's going on with them. Moods, you get a big jolt of estrogen or testosterone, of course you're going to have some mood changes and differences. And so much of this is regulated through this HPA axis, which we have talked about before. And what we know about that HPA axis is that it's a huge route for cortisol and for stress regulation. And it is, the anatomy of it begins back in that 0 to 2 time period in how we regulate our stress and really strengthening that HPA system. Well, in adolescence, because of all the changes that are occurring both neurologically and physiologically, if there is any kind of abnormality in the HPA axis, and if it just was not a strong foundational axis to begin with, then some abnormalities can begin to show themselves in adolescence. And this is why we see anxiety and depression really rise during this time period. I've said this before, but most psychopathologies have an abnormality of the HPA axis, this kind of highway of hormones between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal, cortisol being a big part of that. So we can see how disruptions in that are going to cause anxiety and depression. And and if you think about it, there's a huge rise in it in adolescence. And what's interesting is the APA does surveys somewhat regularly. I don't know when their last, I know in 2013 they did one on stress in America. And our adolescents, our teens, were considered the most stressed out population. So what is that coming from? Is that coming from the increased pressure? Is it coming from this time that they're growing up and yet not having the coping mechanisms, having too much done for, I would get all kinds of answers on that, but take it as you will. Anxiety disorders are huge, and depression is second huge, and they go up dramatically during this time period. And so these hormones can play a big role in some of that if they're not understood and they're not cared for and dealt with. So how does it all work? Well, we have another axis that comes into play here, HPG, hypothalamus to pituitary to the gonads, and a sequence of hormone production that goes that carries particularly the estrogens and the testosterone, sex-specific hormones, to start that menarche and that spermarche and really begin the sexual part of this time period. They are the sex glands, they're the ovaries, the gonads are the sex glands, ovaries in the females, testicles in the males. So they produce hormones and gametes that have, some of those cells that will become the sperm and the egg have been sitting latent in these kind of areas, and now they're going to get this rush of hormones that are going to allow them to begin coming to life and wreaking all kinds of havoc and chaos across high school hallways. So we have the HPA axis, which carries a lot of hormones that regulate hunger, sleep, mood, sexual desire, immunity, stress, all of these kinds of things. And we have the HPG axis, specifically handling the estrogens and testosterones, or the sex-specific hormones, to sort of get going the spermarche and the menarche and the things that will be sex-specific. These sex hormones affect body shape and functioning. Behavior is affected, emotional surges, sexual impulses. Estradiol is kind of the key estrogen. Females produce more, but males do have it. And of course, these are always norms. There can be there can be imbalances in these or differences in these for sure. Testosterone, the best known of the androgens, which are the male hormones, secreted in far greater amounts by males than females. So what I want you to think about is all those thoughts you have about adolescence. And I want you to consider what it's like now that we look back to be 13 years old and to get this huge rush or this increased rush at least, of either estrogen or testosterone. Now, you've already been in middle childhood where, you're comparing yourself in grades, in swiftness, in coolness, in terms of clothes and tech and gear and all this kind of stuff. And how, in your classes and on the playground and all that kind of stuff. And now, added to that, you get sex hormones and you get increase. So so you get an increase in estrogens and or testosterones that are going to affect mood, that are going to affect now. You're not only comparing yourself to to maybe like same sex or what, whatever your kind of attraction magnet thing is. But now you're competing. Now everybody's going to be peacocking around because now they're comparing themselves in terms of who's the most attractive, who's going to, get the girl or get the guy, whatever your preference. And so now we have that on top of it. And then we have these estrogens and testosterones. And just think about it. For a young girl of 12, 13, I mean, even younger these days, of course you're going to be moody. I mean, this is all new. And you have a body that's trying to deal with these actual physiological regulations, but then you also have a mind that has to navigate and integrate all this kind of new information coming from your body and coming from the people around you and judging you in different ways, and you having these desires. And then you have boys. I mean, goodness, let's feel a little bad for them for a moment. Testosterone's one heck of a hormone. And its function, if everything else is taken out, its drive is going to be to fight or procreate. And it's kind of it can be, if not tempered by other things, an aggressive hormone. And you put this in young boys and you stick them, and then you think about it, and then they're just bouncing all over off of each other in high school hallways, and it's a madhouse. So we can get a little feel for what that must be like as these young. I want you to really think about the young ones who this first happens to, as we try to understand what's happening to our body. So let's look at how, when puberty starts specifically, what determines its specific start. So body fat can play a role for girls. Affects the onset of puberty in girls. Heavy girls reach menarche sooner. The idea that we must be at least 100 pounds starts earlier in the cities than rural areas. Why? Maybe because in the cities, people are not as active. You can come up with ideas for that, but we see that it tends to start earlier in cities than in rural areas. There tends to be what we call a secular trend. As nutrition and medication improve, onset has gotten earlier. Because we live in a land of plenty of food. We're not an undernourished or underweight society anymore. And we have plenty of medicine to keep us well. This is kind of leveled off now, but we kind of saw this trend for a while. But people also suspect hormones, steroids in our food. That was also another big thing in our meats. And when we're putting steroids in food, that they're then going into the children and affecting when they get puberty. But I want you to come back up here because I want you to begin to see connections in all of this. That body fat affects the onset of puberty in girls, that heavy girls reach menarche sooner. So then I want you to think about, as this is going on and children are comparing themselves, and now they're comparing and competing with one another for attention and attractiveness and all of this, we're going to get into body image, but this becomes, and so, a part of it. And then heavier girls have, back in middle childhood, if you watch the bullying video, we know that they have a harder time with bullying or treatment as it is. And then they can tend to get their periods earlier. And we're going to talk about this in a minute, but think about it. Is it a positive thing or a tough thing for girls who get their periods first? It tends to be a harder thing. So again, just more stuff that's going on inside that can lend to the challenges of this time period. So let's talk about stress. Stress affects fertility. Now, when people are trying to get pregnant and can't, we'll think about stress as being like something that's keeping them from getting pregnant, but it doesn't seem to work that way with puberty. Stress can increase puberty hormones, and they have found that puberty can arrive earlier for teens who are undergoing a lot of stress, but this can be sort of a chicken or egg kind of thing. If stress impacts puberty hormones, and then we can maybe, move quicker through that cycle, increases them. Is the stress causing the puberty to come early? Or is early puberty, though, as I said, kind of causing stress, and then we get this feedback loop in this cycle? But there was an, I don't think I'm going to do that one. Hold on, sorry. So one longitudinal study showed that a correlation between earlier puberty and harsh parenting in early childhood for girls, especially those who cried a lot as infants, led not only to early menarche, but to increased sexual risk-taking, though not other risks. So let's talk about this. I want you to think, text doesn't talk about this, but why would a young lady who had harsh parenting, maybe not the greatest attachment style in early childhood, who then reaches puberty early, because, okay, there's a correlation between early puberty and early sexual activity. There's a correlation between early sexual activity and early pregnancy. There's a correlation, not a causation. Please be careful. I'm not talking about causations because that gets tricky. We don't know what causes what all the time. But there are correlations between young parenting and harsher parenting. Because there's also a correlation between lower SES and harsher parenting, between greater stress and harsher parenting. So you get young parents who maybe don't have as much money, if they don't have support systems. Of course, that's all going to be dependent upon. So we get a lot of rolled up correlations. So you get a young girl who maybe goes through early, and then she's getting harsh parenting. She goes into puberty early, and why would she have risky sexual behavior? What is she really looking for? Potentially, that attachment. This is where my theory that we're always looking to attach. And if we don't attach in healthy manners to healthy relationships, then we end up potentially attaching to things that are not as good for us, because we're experience expectant for attaching. So we have all these correlations. Now, one of the biggest indicators for when you go through puberty is genetic. So if a young girl has the genetics for early puberty, and then has the harsh parenting, and then we have, and this is not, I'm not saying this always happens. This is a hypothetical generalization, and I get that. But they don't even have to happen. Say they go through early puberty, correlation with early sexual activity, correlation with early pregnancy. And so then we see, we're always talking about, the cycles of early pregnancies and so forth, but genes may have quite a bit to do with that. Maybe stress does have a link. So these are just all things to consider and think about when we're looking at this. Early maturing girls tend to have lower self-esteem, more depression, and poorer body image than later maturing girls. Why? They don't like feeling different. And it's not just, heavy girls. That can happen. But any girl who goes through early, they're different now. Think about it. We're coming from middle childhood where we just want to fit. We don't want to stand out because we might get eaten if we stand out. So we want to fit in somewhere. And now we're different. And that can be hard. Early maturing boys tend to be more aggressive, law-breaking. So again, you're putting testosterone, an aggressive hormone, into very young boys. And if they don't know how to deal with that, if they don't have a healthy HPA system or regulatory system, or they're struggling with it, or there's some dysfunctions going on there, then they can become aggressive, law-breaking, alcohol abusing, then later maturing. But the really later maturing boys tend to be more anxious, depressed, and afraid of sex if they're too far down, because maybe they watch everybody else going through it, and it creates, again, with that social comparison, confusions and not understanding. So all of this ruling again, so we have all this happening. now we're all peacocks in the hallway and we're trying to get attention and we're comparing ourselves to everybody else. And we have all these hormones that are making us either moody and emotional, or they're making us, our sex drives are growing and they're making us maybe aggressive or assertive. And boys and girls are experiencing this maybe a little bit differently. If you think about the differences between estrogen and testosterone, the girls, and it's making them more emotional and wanting to maybe connect more. And the boys, and testosterone is a very different little thing, making them want to connect, but only for a moment. Again, generalizations, and I'm looking at the physiology of this, so it creates chaos. Anyway, a person's body image comes into play here as we're comparing and peacocking about. One reason for poor nutrition is anxiety about body image. Girls diet because boys tend to prefer to date thin girls. Again, generalizations, but this is also what the media does to us. Have videos to watch, a video to watch on this, a few, just to kind of show what this kind of looks like for people, or what it can do to people, how we come to look at ourselves in the world. Boys want to look taller and stronger, partly because girls value well-developed muscles in males. And some of this is evolutionary because you had to compete in order to survive the species. And so over time, whatever, we are definitely victims of our society and our media in how it determines what is attractive and what's not. And this is one I can get very grumpy about. What we will do to ourselves in the name of trying to match the images we see on the screens in front of us can be dangerous and damaging, because we have to really think about these young girls and all that they're going through as it is, between trying to navigate puberty and all of these hormones. And so we end up, unfortunately, some with these eating disorders, anorexia and bulimia. Anorexia, the self-starvation, it can be fatal because over time, because vital organs get deprived of nutrition that they need to run. Bulimia, binging and purging, very dangerous to the system as well. So and what works for this, because eating disorders are a thinking error in general. They are, and then they become a habit, but they get into the head in terms of how we see ourselves, very literally, and how we compare ourselves and what we believe and think about ourselves, and how we value it according to the external physical. Cognitive behavioral has tended to work with eating disorders, some DBT, dialectical behavioral therapies, that we work with the thinking. We have to go to the thinking part. Another thing, I saw research that said that was looking at yoga. Yoga is a beautiful way to work with body image, because it's really about getting in tune with the body and accepting the body where it is if you have a good yoga teacher. I know that some that have maybe tried yoga on DVDs or done it for exercise, it seems and feels a lot like it's about getting the posture right and comparing to how the teacher or other people are doing it. But in its best and finest form, it's really about a mindful connection with our own body and an appreciation for where it is and what it's doing. And when it's done like that, anything that's going to help us honor ourselves, and young girls and boys to honor themselves for who they are. My son is very short. He just is. His father is Filipino and 5'6", and his grandmother on that side is not even 5 feet tall. My family is very average height, so there's not a whole lot of big genes involved. And he doesn't he's not a big eater. He's not a tall kid. And I see him in this 11-year-old time period being part, he's in the middle childhood, being part of the social comparison thing. And it's hard to tell these kids at this age that this is not what's most important, because this is what the world around them, in part developmentally, values. But somehow the only thing I can really tell him, he's not going to be tall. And he's, at some level, finding true value in other things about themselves. These kids have to do, that we all have to do, because God knows we're all going to get old anyway, and it's all going to gray as it's happening and droop and wrinkle and all of that stuff anyway. And so helping young people to value themselves deeply is important. So I'm sorry, that was one of my soapboxes. So I'm going to stop here for physiological, and I'll do another for neurological development.